The administration is fracturing, and what we're witnessing isn't just another political scandal or personnel shakeup. This is a structural collapse that reveals something far more significant about power in America today. When high-ranking officials begin abandoning ship in the early morning hours, when the carefully constructed facade of unity crumbles before the day even begins, we need to ask ourselves what economic and political pressures are actually driving these decisions. This isn't about personalities or Twitter tantrums, though those certainly make headlines. This is about a governing apparatus that's failing to manage the fundamental contradictions it was designed to obscure. Every resignation, every public break, every frantic early morning response exposes the underlying tensions between what this administration promised to its base and what it's actually delivering to the corporate and financial interests that fund our political system. The real story here isn't chaos for chaos's sake. It's the inevitable result of trying to serve two masters: the working people who voted for change and the elite structures that demand preservation of their wealth and influence. When officials quit, they're not just leaving jobs. They're signaling that the internal contradictions have become unmanageable, that the gap between public rhetoric and private policy has grown too wide to bridge. And that gap? That's where we find the truth about American power today. Let's talk about what's really happening when we see these early morning meltdowns and mass resignations. Because if we only focus on the spectacle, if we only pay attention to the theatrical elements of this political drama, we're going to miss the deeper structural story that's unfolding right before our eyes. When officials at the highest levels of government decide they can no longer participate in an administration, when they choose to walk away from positions of tremendous power and influence, we need to understand this as more than just personal disagreements or ethical quandaries. These are calculated decisions made by people who have spent their entire careers navigating the corridors of American power, and their departures signal something profound about the state of governance in this country. Now, the mainstream media will tell you, this is about chaos, about an unmanageable personality, about someone who can't control their impulses in the early hours of the morning. And sure, there's an element of that. But that narrative is fundamentally superficial. It treats politics as if it's a reality television show where personalities clash and drama unfolds for our entertainment. What that analysis misses entirely is the economic foundation beneath all of this political theater. Every administration, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office, operates within a system that has certain non-negotiable requirements. The capitalist economic structure demands growth, demands profit maximization, demands that the interests of corporate America and Wall Street be protected and advanced. This isn't optional. This isn't something a president can simply choose to ignore because they have populist instincts or because they made promises to working-class voters during a campaign. When officials resign, particularly those in key policy-making positions, they're essentially announcing that they can no longer reconcile the contradictions they're being asked to manage. Think about what that means. These are people who have made careers out of reconciling contradictions, out of finding ways to serve multiple masters simultaneously, out of crafting policy that appears to benefit the general public while actually serving elite economic interests. They're experts at this delicate balancing act, so when they walk away, when they decide that the contradictions have become too stark, too obvious, too impossible to navigate, that tells us something crucial about the state of American governance. It tells us that the gap between rhetoric and reality, between campaign promises and actual policy, between what the American people were told they were getting and what they're actually receiving, has grown so wide that even the most skilled political operators can no longer bridge it. Let's consider the economic context in which all of this is happening, because you cannot understand political instability without understanding economic instability. The American economy is structured in a way that creates winners and losers by design. It's not an accident that wealth concentrates at the top. It's not an accident that working people struggle while corporate profits soar. This is how the system functions. It's how it's meant to function. And every president, every administration inherits this structure and must figure out how to manage it, how to keep it running, how to prevent the contradictions from becoming so obvious that people start questioning the entire arrangement. The challenge becomes even more acute when an administration comes to power on explicitly populist rhetoric, promising to drain swamps and fight for forgotten Americans and challenge the establishment. Because now you have to somehow deliver on those promises while simultaneously maintaining the very power structures and economic arrangements that created the problems you campaigned against. This is where the early morning outbursts and the official resignations intersect with deeper systemic issues. When you promise one thing to voters and then discover that the actual levers of power require you to do something entirely different, when you realize that the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department, the network of corporate lobbyists, the demands of Wall Street, the requirements of military contractors, the expectations of pharmaceutical companies and tech giants all have their own agendas that cannot simply be ignored or overridden, you're faced with an impossible situation. You can either break your promises to the voters who elected you, or you can try to fight against the entire institutional and economic structure of American capitalism. Most presidents choose the first option. They quietly abandon their populist rhetoric and govern according to the dictates of economic and political power. But when you have someone who continues to use populist language, who continues to rail against elites and establishments and deep states, even while governing in ways that serve those very interests, the contradictions become unsustainable. The officials who are resigning understand this better than anyone. They're on the inside. They see how decisions are actually made. They see who actually has influence. They see which phone calls get returned and which get ignored. They see which policy proposals get serious consideration and which get quietly shelved. They see the mechanisms through which economic power translates into political power, through which campaign contributions shape legislative priorities, through which corporate interests determine regulatory policy, and they also see the growing disconnect between all of this and the public narrative, between the reality of governance and the performance of governance. At some point, for some of these officials, that disconnect becomes too much to bear. Not necessarily because they're deeply principled people who can no longer stomach the hypocrisy, though perhaps that's true for some of them, but more often because they're professionals who understand that when contradictions become too obvious, when the gap between appearance and reality grows too wide, the entire system becomes unstable. Let's talk about what instability means in this context, because I think people often misunderstand this concept. Political instability doesn't necessarily mean revolution or collapse. It means unpredictability. It means that the normal mechanisms for managing conflict and maintaining order start to break down. It means that the people who usually can be counted on to play their roles, to follow the script, to maintain the facade, start to deviate from their expected behavior. When high-ranking officials resign, they're introducing unpredictability into a system that values predictability above almost everything else. They're signaling to other power players, to corporate interests, to financial markets, to international allies and adversaries that the normal rules might not apply, that the usual assurances might not hold. And this is deeply destabilizing, not because it threatens the survival of American capitalism or American empire, but because it makes the day-to-day management of that system more difficult and more uncertain. Now, let's think about what this means for ordinary working people, for the Spanish-speaking communities across the United States who are trying to understand these political convulsions and figure out what they mean for their daily lives. The mainstream narrative will tell you that official resignations and presidential outbursts are problems because they create chaos and inefficiency in government. But that's only true if you believe that an efficiently functioning government under current arrangements actually serves your interests. If you're a worker watching your real wages stagnate while corporate profits break records, if you're struggling with healthcare costs while pharmaceutical companies post massive earnings, if you're seeing your community's infrastructure crumble while military budgets expand endlessly, if you're dealing with the impacts of climate change while fossil fuel companies continue to receive subsidies, then perhaps governmental chaos isn't your primary problem. Perhaps the problem is that when government functions smoothly and efficiently, it tends to function smoothly and efficiently in service of interests that are not yours. This is the uncomfortable truth that doesn't get discussed in polite political commentary. We're supposed to treat governmental stability as an unquestioned good, as something we should all want regardless of what that stable government is actually doing. But stability for whom? Efficiency toward what ends? When we see officials resigning and administrations in crisis, we need to ask not just what's breaking down, but what was being maintained when things were running smoothly. The answer, more often than not, is that what was being maintained was a set of economic arrangements that systematically transfer wealth upward, that prioritize corporate profits over human needs, that treat healthcare as a commodity and housing as an investment vehicle and education as a debt trap and labor as a cost to be minimized. So when that system experiences turbulence, when the people managing that system start jumping ship, we shouldn't necessarily mourn its instability. We should see it as an opportunity to ask deeper questions about what kind of system we want, what kind of economy serves the majority rather than the minority. The early morning outbursts that characterize this particular political moment are symptoms of someone trying to manage unmanageable contradictions. When you've built a political identity around fighting the establishment while simultaneously being entirely dependent on that establishment's support to govern, when you've promised to challenge corporate power while filling your administration with corporate executives and lobbyists, when you've claimed to represent working people while passing tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefit the wealthy, the cognitive dissonance becomes overwhelming. And what we're seeing in these public meltdowns is that dissonance expressing itself, is the psychological toll of trying to maintain contradictory positions simultaneously. The officials who resign are those who decide they no longer want to participate in managing that contradiction, who conclude that the personal and professional costs have become too high. But here's what we need to understand about the broader pattern. These resignations, these crises, these moments of apparent governmental dysfunction, they come and go. Administrations change, personnel rotate, new officials come in to replace those who left, and yet the fundamental structure of American economic and political power remains remarkably stable. The same corporations continue to dominate their industries. The same financial institutions continue to shape economic policy. The same military-industrial complex continues to drive foreign policy. The same healthcare profiteers continue to extract wealth from sick people. The same real estate speculators continue to price working families out of housing. This underlying stability persists through all the surface-level chaos, through all the resignations and scandals and Twitter storms and early morning meltdowns. And that should tell us something important about where real power lies, about what actually matters in terms of determining who gets what in American society. When we focus exclusively on the personalities, on the drama, on the spectacle of political crisis, we're essentially allowing ourselves to be distracted from the deeper structural questions. We're accepting a narrative that says the problem is this particular person or this particular administration, rather than asking whether the problem might be the system itself, the economic arrangements that any administration must navigate, the power structures that constrain what any president can actually do. This is why, no matter who gets elected, no matter what promises are made during campaigns, the fundamental trajectory of American economic policy remains remarkably consistent. We continue to see wealth concentration at the top. We continue to see corporations gaining power relative to workers. We continue to see public goods privatized and social safety nets eroded, and regulations weakened in the name of competitiveness and growth. These patterns persist across different administrations, across different parties, across different personalities and styles of governance. The officials who are resigning now will be replaced by other officials who will face the same structural constraints, the same impossible contradictions, the same pressure to serve multiple incompatible interests simultaneously. Some of them will navigate these contradictions more skillfully than others. Some will maintain the facade more convincingly. Some will be better at hiding the gap between rhetoric and reality. But the fundamental problem will remain. As long as we have an economic system that concentrates wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands, as long as we have a political system that's funded by and responsive to that concentrated wealth, as long as we treat corporate interests and popular interests as if they can be harmonized through clever policymaking, we're going to continue seeing these cycles of promise and disappointment, of populist rhetoric and elite-serving policy, of dramatic personnel changes that ultimately change very little about who has power and how that power is exercised. So when you see these headlines about officials quitting and early morning meltdowns, by all means pay attention to them. They're symptoms of something. They reveal tensions and contradictions that are worth understanding. But don't let the spectacle distract you from the deeper questions. Ask yourself, who benefits from the current economic arrangements? Ask yourself whether governmental stability and service of those arrangements is really what you want. Ask yourself whether the problem is chaos and dysfunction, or whether the problem is the smooth functioning of a system that systematically disadvantages working people while enriching those who are already wealthy and powerful. These are the questions that matter, the questions that will determine what kind of country we become, what kind of economy we build, what kind of future we create for ourselves and our children.